There is a contrast sitting inside this week's Canadian government announcements that almost no outlet placed side by side. And once you do, it becomes one of the more revealing stories about how reconciliation actually functions inside Canadian policy right now, rather than how it is described in speeches. On one side of the ledger, the federal government has spent recent months defending a piece of legislative language, progressive realization, used to describe the timeline for delivering a constitutionally promised right to clean drinking water for First Nations communities. Critics, including chiefs representing communities that have lived under boil water advisories for over a decade, have called that phrase a legal off-ramp, a way of converting an urgent human right into an indefinite administrative process with no enforceable deadline. On the other side of the same ledger, in the same week, the federal government announced something structurally different. 7 First Nations communities belonging to the Williams Treaties have become minority equity owners in the Darlington Small Modular Reactor Project, one of the largest nuclear infrastructure developments currently underway in Canada. Not consulted, not compensated after the fact. Owners with a direct financial stake in a $715 million federally and provincially backed nuclear facility before a single additional reactor has been switched on. Most coverage treated these as 2 unrelated news items from the same general policy area. They are not unrelated. They are the same government, in the same week, demonstrating 2 entirely different models of what partnership with Indigenous communities looks like when the underlying political incentives point in different directions. Over the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what the Darlington ownership structure entails, why it represents something genuinely new in Canadian infrastructure history, and why understanding what made this model possible tells you precisely why the water crisis has not received the same treatment. Here is what actually happened with Darlington, because the structure itself deserves to be understood in detail, rather than summarized as a vague gesture of partnership. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne announced federal approval of a $715 million loan guarantee for the Darlington New nuclear project in Ontario, which will build 4 small modular reactors with a combined output of 1,200 megawatts. The financing structure splits this guarantee evenly. Half comes from the federal government's Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, and half comes from Ontario's Building Ontario Fund, administered at the provincial level. That 50-50 split matters because of what the federal half specifically enables. The Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program exists for exactly one purpose: to allow Indigenous communities to acquire genuine equity stakes in major resource and infrastructure projects by guaranteeing the financing that would otherwise be inaccessible to communities without the capital reserves that institutional investors or government bodies typically bring to projects of this scale. Equity ownership requires capital upfront, or access to financing on terms that make repayment viable over the life of the asset. Communities that have faced systemic underinvestment for generations do not typically have either. The Loan Guarantee Program is the financial bridge that makes ownership possible rather than merely theoretical. Through this mechanism, 7 First Nations communities connected by the historic Williams Treaties now hold a minority equity stake in the Darlington facility. This is, according to the government's own framing and confirmed by outside analysis, the first time in Canadian history that Indigenous communities have held direct ownership in major nuclear infrastructure. Not a previous generation of energy partnership, not a comparable arrangement in a different sector at this scale. The first time, specifically, in nuclear power. Think about what equity ownership actually changes, because the distinction between this and previous models of Indigenous involvement in resource projects is not cosmetic. Consultation requirements, which have existed in various forms in Canadian law for years, obligate a government or developer to inform and seek input from Indigenous communities before proceeding with a project that affects their territory or interests. Consultation can be meaningful, or it can be minimal. But in either case, it remains fundamentally advisory. The decision-making authority and the financial upside sit with the project's owners and operators, not with the community being consulted. Equity ownership inverts that relationship. An equity stake means a share of the project's long-term revenue. It means, depending on the specific governance terms negotiated, some degree of voice in operational decisions that affect the facility over its decades-long operating life. It means the 7 communities involved are not simply affected parties whose concerns must be addressed before construction proceeds. They are partial owners whose financial interest in the project's success runs parallel to the interests of the federal government, the provincial government, and the other commercial partners involved in Darlington's development. This model did not emerge from nowhere. It sits inside a much larger strategic framework the federal government unveiled just one day before the Darlington financing was confirmed: Canada's National Nuclear Energy Strategy, a 23-page document built around expanding the country's nuclear sector dramatically over the next decade. The strategy's goals are explicit and ambitious. Permit and construct up to 10 new large-scale reactors by 2040. Modernize and export the CANDU reactor design, the Canadian deuterium-uranium technology that does not require enriched uranium and is considered one of the more proliferation-resistant nuclear designs in existence, to become a genuine competitor in the global nuclear export market. Expand Canada's uranium production and nuclear fuel capacity for both domestic use and allied nations. Grow the domestic nuclear workforce from roughly 90,000 workers to over 180,000. This is, in other words, one of the largest industrial expansion plans the federal government currently has in motion, and it carries genuine strategic urgency. Energy security, allied nuclear fuel supply commitments, and Canada's broader positioning as a stable nuclear technology exporter in a world increasingly worried about energy dependency on unstable or adversarial suppliers, all of this depends on building out nuclear capacity quickly, and without the kind of prolonged regulatory and legal conflict that has historically slowed major Canadian infrastructure projects, particularly when those projects intersect with Indigenous land and treaty rights. And this is precisely where the strategic logic behind the Darlington ownership model becomes visible. A government that needs to build 10 new reactors over the next decade and a half has a direct structural incentive to ensure that Indigenous communities along the way are not adversaries in court, but partners with a financial stake in the outcome. Equity ownership is not simply a gesture of reconciliation in this context. It is a mechanism that reduces legal risk, accelerates project timelines, and builds durable community buy-in for a strategy the government considers nationally essential. The Williams Treaties communities are not receiving ownership because the federal government has adopted a uniformly different posture toward Indigenous economic participation across every policy area. They are receiving ownership because nuclear expansion specifically requires exactly this kind of structural alignment to succeed at the pace Ottawa wants it to succeed. Now, hold that against the water file because the contrast becomes precise rather than vague. The clean water commitment that First Nations communities have been waiting on, in some cases for well over a decade, with 36 long-term boil water advisories still active across the country, does not carry the same kind of strategic urgency for the federal government's broader agenda. There is no parallel national strategy document treating water infrastructure delivery as essential to Canada's competitive positioning in a global industry. There is no equivalent of allied nations depending on Canada's water infrastructure timeline the way several countries depend on Canadian nuclear fuel and reactor technology. The phrase progressive realization exists in the water legislation specifically because the government has not built, around water delivery, the same kind of structural incentive that produced equity ownership at Darlington. That is not a moral judgment about which communities deserve what. It is an observation about how policy actually gets prioritized inside a government managing dozens of competing commitments simultaneously. Where a government's strategic interest and Indigenous economic participation point in the same direction, as they clearly do with nuclear expansion, the resulting partnership model can be genuinely innovative and substantively meaningful. Where that alignment does not exist, the language softens, the timelines extend, and concepts like progressive realization fill the gap left by the absence of comparable urgency. The standard has changed in at least one specific corner of Canadian energy policy, and it is worth being precise about exactly what changed and why. For most of Canada's nuclear history, Indigenous communities near major nuclear and energy infrastructure occupied the position of affected parties. Consulted, sometimes compensated, but structurally outside the ownership and profit structure of the projects built on or near their territories. The Darlington model breaks that pattern in a way that is financially real and legally binding, not symbolic. Whether that break extends beyond nuclear power into the other major infrastructure sectors Canada is currently expanding, critical minerals, liquefied natural gas terminals, additional pipeline capacity, will depend entirely on whether the federal government's strategic calculus in those sectors produces the same kind of alignment that nuclear expansion has produced here. Watch two things in the months ahead. First, watch whether the federal government extends the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program's equity model to any of the other major infrastructure projects currently moving through Canada's approval pipeline, because that would tell you whether Darlington represents the beginning of a genuine policy template or remains a strategically convenient exception built for one sector with unusually strong alignment between government priority and Indigenous partnership. Second, watch whether the language attached to the clean water legislation changes in response to the comparison this story makes unavoidable, because a government that can build sophisticated equity ownership architecture for nuclear power in a matter of months has demonstrated that the legal and financial tools to move quickly exist. The remaining question, for water and for every other unresolved commitment sitting under softer language, is whether the will to use those tools exists with the same urgency. A government's relationship with Indigenous communities is not one relationship. It is dozens of relationships, each shaped by the specific strategic weight the government assigns to the project sitting in front of it. Darlington shows what that relationship looks like when the weight is heavy. The water file shows what it looks like when it is not. Both are happening right now, inside the same government, in the same season, under the same Prime Minister. If this story is telling you something you have not heard elsewhere, share it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear it. Like the video if you want more of this, and I will see you in the next.